Welcome to Calm Historian. Today we're stepping into the soot and sunlight of Victorian streets to see how children lived, played, worked, and survived. As you watch, please comment with your location and the current local time where you are. If this quiet journey through the past speaks to you, a like and gentle subscribe would mean a lot. When people picture the Victorian era, they often think of grand palaces, horse-drawn carriages, and gas-lit streets. But the age was shaped no less by its smallest citizens, the children who grew up under Queen Victoria's long reign from 1837 to 1901. Their lives were full of contrasts, the glow of domestic tenderness on one hand, and the hard, unmalleable edges of industrial modernity on the other. And it is in those contrasts that the period comes alive. Imagine a narrow cobbled street in a northern mill town at dawn. Chimneys already breathe out a gray sky. From attic windows come small figures, mouths numb with cold, quickly dressed in layers patched and thin. Some will be led into smoky factories where hours stretch long, machines clatter without mercy, and overseers are quick with a reprimand. Others will be sent down into coal mines, into dim tunnels where light is scarce. Boys were often employed because they could squeeze into tight places, and because the law and custom allowed it. Work began almost as soon as a child could stand, and the day was measured by clanking looms and the hiss of steam. Slowly, the public grew uneasy about what it saw. Parliament, reformers, and outraged writers drew attention to the dangers, and across decades, acts were passed to curb the worst abuses. Dangerous employments were restricted, minimum ages for work were set in some cases, and inspectors began to walk factory floors. Public indignation had real consequences. Even if change came incrementally and unevenly, reform eased some burdens but did not wipe away the need that drove families to send their children out to work. Many small hands still helped keep a household afloat, and small bodies learned to brace against fatigue. A very different childhood existed in middle-class homes. In a parlor warmed by a coal fire, a child might sit with a governess or a mother, learning to read from a moral tale, practicing graceful posture and playing with carefully made toys. Wooden hoops rolled along neat pavements, marbles that clicked in bright sunlight, skipping ropes and picture books whose gilt edges caught the firelight. For these children, childhood was increasingly imagined as a time of innocence and moral formation, an ideal that shaped clothing, literature, and family routines. Outside the comfortable parlors stood the workhouses, built as part of the poor law reforms and designed to manage poverty by making it painfully unattractive. Families who could not pay rent or find steady work faced a cruel choice: accept the harsh, regimented life of the workhouse or struggle on the streets. Men, women, and children could be housed, fed, and clothed there, but only under humiliating conditions. The fear of the workhouse haunted decisions and loyalties. It was as much a social tool as a shelter, forcing poor families into heartbreaking choices about their children. In the streets between parlor and factory, another childhood unfolded: street sellers and urchins whose lives were both precarious and bravely inventive. A child might hawk newspapers in the rain, balance a stack of goods on a small arm, or sweep a pavement for a coin. They learned to read shop shutters and the sound of a pocket opening. These children were survivors and tiny entrepreneurs, their days ruled by the quick calculus of earning and warmed by small joys. the clandestine bun shared with a friend, a laugh exchanged under a shop awning. Religion and charity helped shape many of these lives. Churches and philanthropic groups set up schools and ragged schools for the poorest, where volunteers and clergy taught reading, writing, and arithmetic, alongside lessons about moral conduct. For many children, these schools offered the only route out of grinding poverty, a slow, fragile ladder toward a different life. Then the state began to step in more formally. The Elementary Education Act of 1870 laid the groundwork for organized state schooling, and by the 1880s attendance was more widely enforced. These laws did not erase inequality overnight, but they put books and benches within reach of more children than ever before, changing the texture of childhood in visible ways. Writers and journalists amplified what reformers had exposed. Novelists and reporters painted vivid portraits of cramped, dangerous workplaces and the moral dilemmas of poor families, rousing the consciences of middle and upper-class readers. These portrayals, together with investigators' reports from dark rooms and factory floors, pulled the curtain aside. Children became not simply witnesses to history, but symbols of national vulnerability and of the hope that reform could redeem a society. Health and mortality cast a long shadow over Victorian childhoods. Epidemics, poor sanitation, and limited medical knowledge meant many families lost children to fevers and infections we now prevent. Public health campaigns, improved sanitation, and vaccinations would gradually reduce these threats. But during the mid-century, the reality of disease shaped how parents loved and feared their young. Tenderness was often mixed with dread. Every scraped knee or feverish night could feel heavy with the possibility of loss. Even in the hardest places, though, childhood contained play and imagination. Streets and alleys became theaters of adventure. A stick could be a sword, a puddle a lake, a wall a castle. Singing and rhymes threaded through working-class neighborhoods, small rituals that comforted and connected. For those with a little leisure, Victorians cultivated organized pastimes, parks and promenades where families could stroll and children play under an attentive eye. Birthdays with candles and cakes, Christmases brightened by stories and gifts. These rites made memories and shaped identity amid wider social change. Gender shaped expectations, too. Boys were often prepared to enter work and public life. Girls, depending on class, were trained for domestic roles and the social rules of femininity, with manners and needlework given pride of place. Middle-class girls might hope for an education that matched their social standing, while working-class girls frequently balanced schooling with earning money at home or in factories. Over the century, the idea of childhood as a protected, special phase of life took firmer hold and slowly altered how households treated their young. Across the decades, a steady drumbeat of reform nudged society toward a different understanding of children's rights and needs. Inspectors walked factory floors, charity schools multiplied, and laws sought, however imperfectly, to limit exploitation. These changes were driven by testimony. The voices of impoverished families, the vivid pages of novels, and the reports of investigators who described what they found in dark rooms. Public compassion, practical reform, and the relentless engine of industrial capitalism collided here, producing both suffering and improvement. To listen to the story of Victorian children is to hear many voices at once, the small tired breath of a child emerging from a mill, the button gentleness of a governess teaching a poem by lamplight, the crying and consoling in a workhouse courtyard, the quick triumphant shout of a child who has sold all her newspapers for the day. It is to feel the tug of a parent's hand in a crowded street, and to know the weight of choices made out of love and necessity. These were children of coal dust and candle light, of new schools and old hardships, of moral seriousness and wild play. They did not all share the same days, but together they helped shape the character of a nation. And it is in their small, persistent stories that we best understand what it meant to be a child in Victorian times. Life between 1830 and 1900 moved to a different rhythm, one that bent childhood into shapes we rarely see now. Picture two houses separated by a single city block or a few miles of lane, and you begin to understand how the same era could hold such different lives. Both were unmistakably Victorian, both made of small moments that felt enormous to the children who lived them. In the larger, wealthier homes, the day was measured and restrained. Rooms were big and carefully arranged. Heavy drapes kept the light steady, and the air often smelled faintly of beeswax and lavender. Children wore clothes that announced their place, fine fabrics, stiff collars, shoes polished until they shone. Their hours were parceled out in lessons, deportment and languages, piano practice under a watchful governess, long rehearsals of manners that left little room for spontaneous laughter. Piano notes rose and fell like lace in the air, and the ritual of correctness ruled the day. That life bred a quiet, persistent boredom, not the easy kind of idle play, but a hush that settled over little faces turned toward the window. They watched the world outside, the carts, the dogs, other children at play, and were taught never to touch it. Parents were rarely cruel, but intimacy was rare too. Conversations were formal, clipped by strict social codes. A father might step forward with a serious word and then return to his papers. A mother showed care through the careful supervision of posture and propriety. In learning the language of decorum, many children lost the ease of unguarded speech. Across class lines, in humbler rooms with thin walls and low ceilings, childhood took on another shape. Here children rose with the household and went straight into the work that kept the family alive. The city's public spaces, markets, workshops, factories became their classrooms. The air tasted different. Coal smoke, bread baking, the call of street sellers, the steady rhythm of labor. Toys were homemade. A rag doll stitched by a tired hand, a rough wooden soldier carved with a brother's knife, and loved without regard to what they lacked in polish. Those playthings carried the family's fingerprints and were treasured for it. Love in these homes was plain and immediate. With fewer servants to stand between parent and child, life was a shared enterprise. Meals, when there was food enough, were eaten together under a single lamp. The day's weariness was exchanged in low voices over the table. Small triumphs were celebrated, failures comforted directly. A parent's calloused hand might steady a child on the first day of work. A whispered story by candlelight chased away the cold. Parents showed pride in tired faces, the quiet look that said, "I know you helped keep us afloat." So the century held two kinds of childhood. One learned to be proper and silent in the bright stillness of ornate rooms. The other learned the weight and worth of work in crowded streets and workshops. Both worlds shaped their children, one through restraint and instruction, the other through labor and intimacy. And both left marks that lasted far beyond the small hands and small faces of the era. They grew up with every comfort money could buy. Rooms the size of small houses, wardrobes lined with silk and linen, baskets of toys that gleamed like little treasures, and window seats that looked out over gardens kept immaculate by gardeners. Afternoons were often spent on cool marble steps in the sun, servants ready to answer the smallest need, and dinners laid out with more silver than a poorer household might see in a year. Clothes were changed for morning, noon, and evening. Parties and calls filled the social calendar. New things arrived as if by design, the quick solution to any momentary whim. Yet beneath that bright surface there was another economy at work, one of feeling rather than finance. Affection could be an exchange of convenience rather than warmth. When adults touched a child, the movements were careful and formal. The pat of a hand on a cheek, the straightening of a collar, the composing of a face for a portrait. Gestures made more from duty than impulse. The grown-ups carried obligations that reached far beyond the nursery, obligations of status, lineage, and appearance that were meant to be upheld at all costs. Children learned to be seen and to behave, not necessarily to be held when afraid or comforted when uncertain. Their days fell into a measured plan, lessons and instruction, supervised play, attendance at the right gatherings. That repetition, same routine morning after morning, left many children with a nagging sense of redundancy. Toys, though plentiful, were often instruments of training. Play was sculpted to cultivate correct manners rather than wild, imaginative adventure. Education could feel like a performance, accomplishments polished and displayed to secure the family's standing. In the rooms where they lived, silence could be as strict as any tutor. Voices were moderated, laughter measured, and the smallest breach of decorum corrected with dignified firmness. A child might be beloved, but often in a particular way, adored for the role they represented. The pretty child at a neighbor's tea, the heir who would someday carry a title, the daughter whose sewing and reading proved the household's taste. These were forms of affection with conditions attached. When love was given, it wore a public face, trimmed with propriety and always mindful of who was watching. Private grief or confusion had fewer outlets. Longing, when it surfaced, was likely to be observed and instructed away. Feelings were taught to be managed rather than explored, and tears were for a private room, not for the drawing room where a guest might arrive at any moment. So while material comforts set them apart from the grinding hardships of poorer childhoods, they also enclosed them. There was a loneliness that comes not from lack, but from surplus. So many things, and no one to show you how to keep them from feeling empty. A wealthy child might be called spoiled because nothing was withheld, yet spoiled in that sense often meant being starved of the casual, unguarded human contact that turns objects and rituals into meaning. It is a paradox of that era. Lives comfortable beyond imagining, and for all that comfort, stranded in a landscape of careful silences and prescribed kindnesses. Step closer, and let your ears tune to a different century. Subscribe to Victorian Children, not just to receive notices of new essays and posts, but to open a window into streets that smelled of coal and bread, into kitchens warmed by small hearths, and into factory floors pulsing with machines. Each message will arrive like a small lamp carried along the alleys of time. Concise dispatches that bring back the scuffed shoes and bright eyes of boys and girls who learned to laugh and to bear, who played with hoops beneath gaslight, and sometimes went to bed hungry. Imagine the city as a living thing. Soot-darkened brick, the rattle of carts on cobbles, the distant hiss of steam from a train that seems to split the day in two. In that world, childhood did not wear a single face. For some, it was bounded by the soft rituals of middle-class life. Desks in a schoolroom, needlework lessons for girls, arithmetic and composition for boys, afternoons of parlor games, tutors and governesses, and well-lit reading. For others it was measured by the hour on a loom, at a coal face, or up a narrow chimney, a life marked by the clang of a bell and the demand of labor, not play. Subscribe, and you will meet them all, the delicate and the hardened, the taught and the self-taught. Every update carries stories of contrast and continuity, reformers, writers, and ordinary neighbors who noticed and named injustice, and the slow, often imperfect remedies that followed. You will read of ragged schools and charitable groups teaching children to read by candlelight, of laws passed piecemeal to curb the worst excesses of child labor, and of the stubborn persistence of disease in crowded lanes alongside earnest, sometimes crude attempts to prevent it. These were not abstract policies, but small details that shaped a day. The closing of a mill at dusk, the one-room schoolhouse's bell, the midwife's comforting hand, the urgency of a mother's prayer. Listen for the little triumphs that made ordinary lives glow. A book discovered that opens an imagined world, a makeshift ball tossed between laughter in a rain-slick yard, the fierce private joy when a child learns to write their own name for the first time. And listen for the sorrows that sharpen those triumphs, the loss of an older sibling to fever, the aching fatigue in small bodies, the quiet resignation of families who could do no more than keep going. The voices in these dispatches are not abstractions, but living presences. A child humming as they sweep, a teacher who tills a mind into bloom, a reformer who sees faces in statistics and cannot look away. Each post is meant to be more than information. It is an atmosphere. Imagine a letter from a particular street, a lamppost, a schoolroom, richly described, historically faithful, and humane. You'll be led through seasons of soot and springtime, through festivals and funerals, through the ways adults tried to protect what they could of childhood, and the ways children carved out play and hope amid hardship. The writing pays attention to texture, the grit of a playground, the hush of a bedside, the sudden brightness of a firework over a factory roof. Expect careful, accurate reconstructions, names and dates where they matter, context where it clarifies, and always an ear for the small human noises that make history true. These updates aim to make the past speak in the particulars, the rhythm of a machine, the scrape of a pencil, the soft mutter of a prayer. They remember the practical as well as the poetic, so that policy and feeling sit side by side and illuminate one another. Let these messages be your companion. Let them bring the past near enough to touch, the rough wool of a jumper, the sweet steam of a bread oven, the tremor in a child's laugh at the sight of fireworks. Subscribe, and your inbox will become a small museum of lives lived. A steady string of narratives that illuminate the world of Victorian children with sympathy, precision, and the warm, relentless voice of a storyteller who refuses to let those stories be forgotten. I agree to my personal data being used for interest-based advertising as outlined in the privacy notice. Those are the first words, almost an aside, folded into the margin like a small promise. Then come 3 words on the screen: website, your email, subscribe. They sit there, spare and almost brittle, arranged like a tiny altar to attention. Simple as a street sign, they look like nothing. Yet look closer, and you see how much they contain. A pale rectangle of light, a small empty invitation for someone to step forward and offer a piece of themselves. An address, a name, an entry point into a network of promises. Picture a late room lit only by the glow of a monitor. The cursor pulses like a patient heartbeat in the narrow field after your email. Around it, the rest of the screen has surrendered to silence. Margins breathe, the layout is minimal, and those single words carry the weight of a choice. To someone passing by, it might read as routine. To the person who pauses, hands above the keys, it becomes a hinge between private and public, between what is kept and what is given away. Website sits at the top, like the map's edge, a place that could hold news, music, a story, or commerce. It suggests both a house and a marketplace, a living thing made of code and curation. Below your email is an open mouth waiting for a word. The ellipsis stretches like a breath not yet exhaled, a brief accountability that remains unfulfilled until the first character appears. And subscribe, in its short, blunt capital letters, is both invitation and mild command. Warm with the promise of updates, belonging, interruption, the steady drip of a relationship conducted through messages. There's a small drama in this terse layout. The hands hover, hesitate, then move. Fingers find keys. The characters arrive one by one. A letter, a punctuation, the quiet assertion of presence. With that final press, the cursor slips from its lonely blink into motion. A quiet exchange is consummated, a small covenant struck between a person and a name on a screen. Often there is that consent line waiting too, a little clause about data and ads that people click away or read. It is part of the ritual, a fine print companion to the louder word, subscribe. Later the inbox might return the favor. A welcome message, a confirmation, a link that opens another door. Or nothing may happen at all, and the moment will live only in the memory of a brief hesitation, the scrawl of characters, and the soft click that follows submitting. In such slender icons and simple words lie the intimacy and risk of modern contact. A small ritual repeated millions of times, each one ordinary and quietly profound. In wealthy households, the child's world was often shaped by a single, steady presence. The nanny. She stood between the small ones and the rest of the house, a constant voice that taught manners and enforced rules. With a soft scolding or a firm example, she set the line between what was proper and what would be scorned. Morning after morning, the same lessons were given. How to hold a spoon without slurping, how to lower the eyes in the presence of elders, what words belonged to polite conversation and which were best swallowed. And through repetition, the nanny's authority became a familiar comfort. Daily life fell into a map of small, ordered rituals. Rooms were kept respectable, toys put away at appointed hours, curtains drawn to filter daylight into an even, genteel glow. Meals arrived like clockwork. Walks, when allowed, were short, measured promenades intended to teach little feet the decorum expected of them. Even pleasure was folded into form. A carefully chosen poem recited at the proper moment, a song hummed softly rather than a shout. The household prized restraint, and every movement was shaped by that quiet discipline. There was, inevitably, a loneliness to such strictness. The child's companions were often the nanny and the quiet objects of the nursery. A carved rocking horse with its worn mane, a row of neatly placed dolls whose painted eyes watched the day go by, the soft rustle of fabric when someone moved. There were few rash friends, few boisterous games to break the smooth surface of routine. Days blurred into one another, marked more by the sequence of duties than by surprises or discoveries. Still, the formality carried its own weight and purpose. Every curtsy taught, every gentle admonition was practice for a life in which order mattered. Under the nanny's patient, sometimes stern hand, children learned to fit themselves into a world that prized calm and propriety above noise and disorder. The lessons were precise and inescapable. To be proper was to be safe, and in those households, safety, secured by rules and quiet vigilance, was the greatest kindness they could offer. Wealthy Victorian children rarely communicated with their parents except for a specified time each day. Picture one of those houses of propriety. Heavy curtains, polished mahogany, a drawing room where conversations were clipped and manners were learned like lessons. Adults spoke in rehearsed tones, and feeling was something kept carefully in reserve. Into that neat, ordered world walked the small boy who, many years later, would remember the exact number of times his mother had hugged him. Winston Churchill liked to say, with a dry little smile that kept the memory intact rather than softened it, that he could count those embraces. It was not boastful neglect, but a small, precise confession. An old man measuring a smallness against the long reach of his life. The smile made the memory linger, a gentle framing that turned absence into something observed rather than accused. In such a house, a mother's arms were not an unending refuge, but a rare, deliberate shelter. Each embrace closed a distance for a breath, and precisely because it was so uncommon it became vivid. Those moments were brief and intense, like a door opening just long enough for a warm current of air to pass through before the room went still again. You can imagine how scarcity sharpened the memory. Each hug was counted, treasured like a collector's handful of rare coins. Small objects held carefully in the palm. The touch itself would have been warm and sudden, as brief as the click of a latch. A pressed shoulder, a quick straightening of a coat, the faint trace of perfume, the muffled hush of voices beyond the doorway, slipping away for a heartbeat. Such recollections live in tiny details. The tilt of a chin, the pattern of light falling through a drawing-room window, the hush of voices in the corridor, and then the inevitable return to formality, to composed faces and quiet rooms. Those few embraces became landmarks on a boy's map of feeling, little compasses pointing toward a tenderness that was both treasured and oddly sharpened by its rarity. As an adult, he carried that memory like a private keepsake, one fragment among many shaping the man who would speak to nations. The counting was not an accusation, but an honest accounting, a way of saying that intimacy had been measured and kept. In the telling there is warmth rather than bitterness, and a recognition that what is rare can sometimes become more necessary for the soul than what is plentiful. That single, simple remark opens the door to a quiet human truth behind the public figure. Even the most resolute are, at their core, still shaped by those small, decisive gestures of love. They did not leave the raising of children to chance. In hundreds of households, the warm weight of a sleeping head and the small urgent cries that required answering at any hour were entrusted to someone else. A nurse, a nanny, a substitute parent in every practical way. Parents set the course. Careful instructions, firm standards, and it was the nanny who translated that map into the child's daily life. Day after patient day, with hands that soothed, voices that taught, and eyes that watched. Picture a house in soft morning light, the nursery curtains drawn back, the faint smell of starch and boiled milk, the steady rhythm of chores that keep a home moving. In that quiet room, the nanny paced a small kingdom. She taught first steps and first words, coaxed vegetables into small mouths and patience into small hearts. What the parents imagined, politeness, education, propriety, a particular way to move through society, she turned into ritual. Mannerisms were corrected mid-sentence. Table habits were rehearsed until they felt natural. Primers and books were laid out for the appointed hour. Even the clothes were part of the lesson. Ribbons and folds placed just so. Buttons sitting in the right line. Every tiny detail acted as a public script of belonging, and the nanny learned how every stitch and tuck mattered. There was an intimacy to that apprenticeship. A child's world was measured by the nanny's footfalls and the cadence of her speech. For parents occupied with business, social obligations, or the endless management of a household, the nanny was both relief and necessity. They taught her the virtues they prized, manners, learning, propriety, and relied on her to instill them with the steady repetition of daily care. But this practical arrangement held a quiet, complicated tenderness. The nanny cradled not only a child's body, but the delicate shape of their character, watching for small shifts in temperament, gently nudging curiosity forward, soothing the fears that surfaced in the dark. To the child, she was both authority and comfort, the steady presence who set limits and also offered the consolation allowed within them. To the parents, she was an extension of themselves, the person who carried their expectations into practice. Yet she often commanded a deeper affection and sometimes a devotion the parents could not give. In the rooms where children were made, the nanny's hands wrote the daily chapters of upbringing, the recitation of lessons, the rehearsal of greetings, the silent insistence on posture, or the correct cut of a sleeve. Each tiny correction, each shared story, each moment of reprimand or tenderness became part of the child's composition. That arrangement folded private desires into public presentation. How a child sat, spoke, or chose an outfit was not mere taste, but an expression of family identity, and the nanny was the artisan assigned to that craft. With patience and steady repetition, manners sunk in, lessons took root, and the appearance of propriety that the parents wanted slowly emerged. Tireless, intimate, often unheralded, the nanny was the hinge between aspiration and habit, turning the parents' ideals into lived practice in the small, decisive moments of childhood. Winston Churchill's nanny, when we picture a nanny today, it's almost instinctive to imagine a cheerful, trained young woman who has sat in classrooms and seminars, studied child development, and earned a qualification that marks her as a professional companion to a child. That comforting, modern image, friendly, credentialed, and at ease within a family's private life, feels so familiar that it's easy to assume it has always been that way. But step back into the long gaslit rooms of the Victorian age, and the reality looks very different. The nursery in a grand Victorian house was not merely a quieter corner of the drawing room. It was a room of its own, a small world governed by rules and staffed like a separate household. Care was a patchwork of roles, rather than the work of a single trained caregiver. Wet nurses, nursemaids, governesses, and matrons each had duties carved out by custom and class. These women were rarely young graduates of any formal course in childhood. They were employees of a social order that valued experience and obedience above certificates. They learned on the job, by watching and by necessity, under the strict eyes of housekeepers and stern matrons who enforced schedules and proprieties with little indulgence. For many children of the wealthy, that system produced distance as much as care. Fathers and mothers were often absorbed in public life, social obligations, or the management of estates. A child's day was marked by regimented meals, formal lessons from a governess who taught from a book, and a steady rotation of attendants who came and went. When affection existed, it was frequently offered by those who served in the nursery, rather than by the parents themselves, creating tender but complicated bonds between child and servant. Discipline could be strict, comfort functional, and intimacy measured. The room itself testified to its purpose. The faint starch scent clinging to tiny collars, the polished wood of cradles and high chairs catching the light, heavy curtains drawn to keep nursery daylight dim and separate from the family's public life. You can almost hear the soft shuffle of slippers and the quiet folding of linen, a domestic soundtrack that kept childhood protected but also contained. That is not to say love was absent. Many women in service cared for the children entrusted to them with real devotion. But the image of a single, professionally trained companion moving easily between home and education is a modern comfort, not the Victorian norm. Upbringing in wealthy households was shaped by social convention and clear lines of authority. A domestic staff used to hierarchy, and a class that often put public duty above private intimacy. The compassionate, credentialed nanny of today makes an appealing story. The quieter truth of the Victorian nursery is richer and more complicated, a tapestry of duty, routine, and human attachment, woven into the fabric of a household that kept its children safe, taught them manners, and by design, kept them at a certain remove. They were, more often than not, women already set into the later chapters of life. Hair silvered at the temples, hands that told stories of years of work. In the parlors and nurseries of old houses, they moved with a quiet certainty, as if the world should bend to right angles and every object know its place. A place for a spoon, a place for a lesson, a place for a child to sit and be seen but not heard. They had not married, and in a society that fed the rumor mill and measured a life by the number of children at a table, that unmarriedness carried a private weight. Not being wives or mothers shaped the way they stood at the window, the way they smoothed a cuff, the way they answered when a small hopeful voice asked for an extra story at bedtime. A child's bright face could read those small cues like an open page. One look that lacked gentleness red as a shelf of restrained longings, a stack of small disappointments waiting to topple. There was a pebble of something, pride, regret, habit, lodged like a stone beneath the tongue, and that pebble changed the tone of a nursery. Where another woman might bend down, speak softly, or excuse a spill with a laugh, these nannies sometimes followed a different script. Years of being self-contained had taught them to carry their lives without complaint. That steely self-sufficiency sometimes hardened into impatience with childish mess and childish needs. A tantrum might be met not by comfort, but by a mix of the practical and the impatient, a brisk hand, a clipped rebuke, the slow withdrawal of warmth as if kindness were a luxury to be rationed. Often the pattern repeated itself like cobbles in a path, guiding little Afit to step precisely between them. Intolerance took many small forms, voices that needed no raising, nevertheless cut. Expectations stood tall and uncompromising. The strictness was systematic, a rigid timetable for eating and learning, for being awake and for being seen, so that the nursery could feel like a small, well-ordered world in which kindness proved conditional and softness was rare. For the children who learned to measure love by the gentleness of touch, that ordering could sting. It made the room feel tidy but cold, safe but lonely. Sometimes the nanny's discipline veered into plain meanness, a cold glance that lingered too long, a remark that trimmed a child's curiosity the way one trims a hedge. Those moments left a particular hurt, small but lasting in children who equated care with warmth, and whose small bodies needed more than rules. They needed edges softened, questions encouraged, hands that stayed. Behind that austerity, though, there was often complexity a child could not read. These women carried histories of choices, shaped by a culture that left few roads for an unmarried woman. A lifetime of work demanded a hard shell for protection. In the hush of the nursery at the end of a long day, you could almost perceive the quiet calculations that made kindness a scarce currency. Unpaid labors, stifled hopes, the daily tally of what must be maintained. That does not excuse the sting of words, or the way firmness curdled into cruelty, but it does make the figure of the nanny less a mere caricature, and more a human presence carrying the weight of what had been and what had not. So the relationship between caretaker and child was rarely a simple exchange of affection. It was a negotiation conducted under the watchful eye of age, of unmet expectations, and of a culture that measured lives by marriage and motherhood, understanding that complexity does not erase the pain it caused, but it opens the room to a kinder kind of telling, one that sees both the strict rules laid like cobblestones and the quiet, complicated life that walked them. There were nannies who, against all odds, became the central warmth in a child's life. They did more than keep a house in order. They learned the little ways to brighten a child's day, playing games that coaxed a laugh, finding the small pleasure of fixing a special meal on a birthday. For some children, those quiet acts of care were the only love they ever knew. These children lived in the shadow of another world, while wealthier families shut themselves behind polished doors and rooms filled with carpets, painted toys, and the soft glow of comforts. Poorer Victorian families knew a different kind of home, smaller, quieter in its pleasures, louder in its hardships. Often that home was no more than a single room that had to contain an entire life. Picture a narrow stairway that smells faintly of coal and damp, opening into a room that is bedroom and kitchen and sitting room all at once. A single window throws a slant of gray light over an assortment of necessities. A table, scored with years of meals, a few wooden chairs, a bed where more than one person sleeps. Curtains, if they exist, are thin. The floorboards creak under feet that must be mindful of one another. Privacy is rare. Children fall asleep to the low murmur of their parents' voices and wake to the city outside. Cries, carts, footsteps, because there is nowhere else for the noise to go. There are no cupboards stacked with finery, no trunks of new clothes waiting for the season. Outfits are patched and mended, handed down or washed until the fabric knows every hand that ever held it. Coats are for warmth, not fashion, and shoes are worn until the soles thin and leak. The bright, extravagant toys of the rich. Painted horses, clockwork soldiers, dolls with perfect faces are absent, yet play does not disappear. Small imaginations make much of little. A scrap of cloth becomes a dress for a rag doll. A bit of string becomes the center of a game. Marbles are hoarded like treasure. The joy is quieter, and the pleasures are harder won, but they are no less real. Food is practical and plain, rather than a parade of indulgence. There are no delicacies laid out for every small celebration. Meals are efficient and shared closely. Often the same simple dishes around the same table, where the family's plans and sorrows are talked through. In that single room, a dozen small routines interlock. Someone hurriedly stitching a sock, another bent over a small task by lamplight, a child reading aloud if reading is within reach, or a pair of siblings huddling together to tell a story. Still, within those cramped walls there is a warmth money cannot buy. The hush of a mother smoothing hair, a father's steady hand on a shoulder, the whispered conspiracies of brothers and sisters who must lean on one another. To be poor in Victoria's cities was to live without embroidered comforts, in houses far smaller than those across the street, sometimes no larger than a single room, but it also shaped a fierce togetherness, a talent for making a home from the barest things, and the ability to find play and tenderness where the world offered very little. They lived elbow to elbow, every inch of space claimed by bodies and the small necessary things that follow them. Bowls, a patched coat, a stool. The rooms seemed to shrink a little with every child born. Curtains hung like tired flags, and a thin light found its way through the grime, tracing the curve of a cheek or the line of a hand. The walls held the scent of boiled potatoes and wood smoke, and a steady rhythm of footsteps, coming and going, running and dragging, set the pace of the day. In that house distance was impossible. Mornings and nights braided into one continuous motion, and the household was felt more in the weight of people than in the count of rooms. Children moved within that closeness, as if it were a learned geometry. They dressed in the dim light, shoulders brushing, jostling gently for a place at the table. Whispers threaded from bed to bed, long after the lights had been snuffed. Knowing the angle of a parent's shoulder, or the particular cadence of their voice, was not intimacy by accident, but a skill honed by necessity. They quickened at the sound of a footstep, found comfort in the habitual scrape of a chair, and could tell, in the small habits that soothed or annoyed, exactly where they fit in the household pattern. There were no nannies to soften the edges between adult decisions and childhood. Everything about a child's upbringing, the scoldings, the lessons, the consolations, fell to the parents, who became the firm, unrelenting architects of daily life. A father's patient hand tugging a mitten over a cold finger, a mother's voice calling down a shadowed hallway, a lesson given while mending a shirt or sweeping the floor. These ordinary acts shaped the children as much as any formal teaching. That steady presence could be a source of warmth and security, the anchor in a world that offered few guarantees, and it made the household feel, for all its hardship, like something held together by intention. Yet intimacy and closeness did not always mean gentleness. Practical needs bent the family toward hard calculations, and affection could be tangled with necessity. When survival depended on every coin and every willing pair of hands, children were sometimes seen in the quiet light of utility, as helpers, as contributors, as income. Many of those children spent daylight hours not at play, but in the market and on the street, sweeping, shining, running errands, selling a small service or a scrap. Earned coins, clinking in a palm, carefully counted and folded into the household sum, became a measure of a child's value alongside laughter and bedtime stories. For countless families, this became a grim arithmetic, simple, brutal, and rational. More children who worked meant more income. Another small hand could mean another wage to add to the pot. The choice to bring another child into such a life was often weighed between hope and calculation, hope for help in the future, calculation for the present. That is why so many households were crowded with 10 or a dozen children, an intimate, noisy economy where life and labor braided together, and where love, duty, and survival lived side by side in the same small room. They were small enough to curl into a breadbasket, and old enough by the standards of the time to be put to work. In the Victorian years, the world expected even the littlest bodies to earn their keep. Children who today we would call toddlers were sent out at dawn, trailing blankets and rags, their feet already familiar with hard streets and factory thresholds. As unbelievable as it sounds now, some were thrust into labor at 4 or 5 years of age. Children whose voices still sounded like the echo of adult commands, whose hands learned tools and chores before they had learned to read a single line of a book. Picture the thin light of a winter morning slipping through a narrow alley, settling on a child's face as they rise before the household has fully woken. Hear the hush broken by hurried footfalls, a tin pail clutched in a small fist, the metallic clatter of a workshop gate swinging open for yet another day. In mills and workshops, in fields and humble kitchens, in the dim recesses where the city's work must always be done, children's days were long and shaped by other people's needs. They carried coal and wood, tended animals, mended garments, threaded bobbins, and kept the relentless machinery fed with whatever tasks the day demanded. Their shoulders bore the weight of necessity. Their play was brief, squeezed into scraps of light and rare afternoons. Hands that should have been learning to draw or to play learned instead to stitch and to feed hungry engines. The hours were steady and unkind, measured by the clack of looms, the cry of animals, the clock that never forgave. This was not a quirk of a single generation. For centuries, families expected their youngest to contribute, not seen as an isolated tragedy, but as an ordinary, if unforgiving, part of survival. That continuity made it harder for gentle indignation to uproot the practice. It was accepted, taught, and handed down like a trade. Parents who had learned the same routines as children bore the same resignation, and entire communities arranged their lives around the small, steady labor of their young. Listen, and you can almost hear those little voices raised to be useful, the tiny feet hardened by gravel and grit, the quiet bargaining between childhood and necessity. There is a patient resignation in it, a way of learning the world not by play, but by doing its hardest work. Those images linger, not merely as history, but as the lived mornings and worn hands of a time when childhood and labor were woven together, stubborn as any custom. They rose before the sun, and did not stop until long after it had set. Morning light was an idea more than a comfort, a pale promise seen from the doorway as they slipped out into streets still cool with sleep. Their days bent in one direction, forward, down, and then forward again, bodies curved over benches, machines, and looms, until posture itself felt like a permanent fold. The work demanded everything their small frames could give, and returned only exhaustion, as if the hours had been measuring out their strength, piece by piece. Those hours were long and unrelenting. Each shift blurred into the next, a steady, mechanical rhythm of motion and duty that left them hollow-eyed and bone-tired. They carried labor meant for grown men, hauling responsibility back to houses that leaned on their wages. Work was not a choice or a lesson. It was the thin, hard thread that held a household together. Every hour earned paid another bill, kept the roof from leaking a little longer, put a loaf of bread on a table that otherwise might have gone bare. Safety on the job was an afterthought, a culture of carelessness that wrapped itself around the workshops like dust. They learned to move quickly, to step where needed without the luxury of caution, because hesitation could mean falling behind the pace and falling out of favor. Sharp edges and slippery planks were part of the landscape. Unseen risks waited under machines and in the seams of the day. Rules that might have protected them were often imagined rather than enforced, contracts written on air. So they made bargains with pain. A limp from a misstep, a burned palm, a cough that scratched the chest, and kept working because the day's pay could not be refused. Filth was commonplace and stubborn. Hands and clothes took on the color of the work. Grime ground into hems, soot mapped across cheeks, sweat streaking like quick rivers down necks. The air tasted and smelled of labor, oil, dust, wet wool, hot metal, and those scents clung to skin and hair, to the slow exhale of bodies that had been pushed without pause. They wiped faces with the back of a hand and moved on. There was no time to chase away discomfort when the next task already demanded attention. There was no real choice at home, either. Parents pressed their children into work not as a cruelty, but as a practical answer to a house that could not be kept afloat otherwise. Bills loomed like dark shapes at the edge of the day. Mouths needed feeding, and the extra pair of hands was a literal lifeline. The labor of the young counted in coin and in calories. A terrible arithmetic that balanced a family's needs against the price of childhood. And so they answered that call, steeled by a mixture of duty, fatigue, and a quiet, stubborn resilience. They learned the practical truth that their hours mattered. Each minute on the factory floor could mean another night warmed by a stove, another patch on a coat. They kept going, not because anyone praised them, or because the work honored them, but because there was simply no other path to follow. In the hum of machines and the dimming light of long days, they carried on, anonymous and necessary, the backbone of survival in a world that had little spare mercy to give. The streets and alleys of Victorian towns thrummed with a human tide that included far more small, weary bodies than any passerby might expect. Children were not an occasional presence, but the backbone of countless trades, in steady, almost eager demand, because they were cheap labor. You could see them everywhere, tiny figures slipping into the mouths of coal pits, faces streaked with the carbon of subterranean work, hands too small for the machine, threading and tending in the great factories, broom and bucket in cramped hands as they swept the streets at dawn, fingers nimble over hat brims and clothing seams in dim, crowded workshops. They were called on to do chores adults could not easily do or would not take on for so little pay, and their smallness became, in the eyes of employers, a practical advantage. Picture a child at the coal face, shoulders hunched beneath a low roof, where daylight was only a memory and the air was a blind, grit-filled thing. In the mills, the noise was another hazard, a constant clatter of looms and belts and the whir of spindles that never seemed to sleep. There, quick little hands were prized for slipping between moving gears or tying off wayward threads, movements so fast and small they saved machines from jamming and saved owners a wage bill. On the cobbles before the shops, street sweepers moved like sentries of the morning, their brooms scraping away the grit of the night, so merchants and gentlemen could pass with clean shoes. In workshops where garments and hats were made, a child leaned over a bench would stitch tiny hems or shape straw, and felt, working with a patience born not of choice, but of necessity. Other jobs edged into darker territory. Chimney jobs forced little bodies up narrow flues, soot-blackening lashes and skin as children crawled where shoulders and hope alike were squeezed tight. Farm work taught young hands the hard geometry of soil and fence, a different kind of endurance beneath open skies. Textile mills echoed with the same human rhythm, each push and pull of machinery matched by children moving to keep production endless. Many more served as household servants, quick at the stair and ready in the kitchen, learning the strict hierarchies of houses that expected obedience before childhood. And, tragically, some were driven into the most harrowing of circumstances: prostitution, a grim testament to how far exploitation could go when youth could be bought cheaply. These scenes were not isolated curiosities, but the threads of everyday life, woven together into a fabric of soot and sewing, of early mornings and late nights. The demand for cheap labor had made children indispensable to so many trades, and the result was a society that, in practice, treated its young as units of work rather than simply as children. Those tiny hands shaped more than products. They also shaped the harsh contours of a nation's working life, leaving marks that would be visible for generations. A further look into child labor and working conditions can be found here. In the year 1824, a small but determined idea took shape and was given a name: the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. Imagine the London it entered. Cobbled streets still wet from rain, the steady creak of wooden wagons, and the soft, patient breathing of horses and dogs pressed into service by a fast-changing city. Out of a growing unease with cruelty and a fresh sense of moral responsibility came a group that would be both witness and advocate for those who could not speak for themselves. Their founding marked one of the first formal public efforts to curb deliberate harm, to call for compassion where habit and custom had too often hardened into indifference. Time moved on, and the century unfolded in a sweep of industry, migration, and shifting social expectations. 67 years after that first beginning, in 1891, another society was formed. The Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. If the earlier effort had begun to turn concern for living creatures into action, this new foundation reached further, toward the most vulnerable human lives. Children with small voices could be lost in the din of factories, the hush of overcrowded tenements, or the rushed anonymity of city streets. The later society picked up the moral thread and carried it into places where suffering was quieter but no less urgent. Those two dates, 1824 and 1891, stand linked across decades as a measured arc of growing public conscience. It wasn't a sudden enlightenment, but a slow, steady widening of care, first toward animals, then toward children, as a society learned to recognize and respond to suffering wherever it was found. The story they began is one of quiet persistence, ordinary people shaping law, custom, and compassion so that the voiceless might at last be heard. When you step into the world of the Victorian mills, you don't just see hard work. You feel it pressing into your bones. The air hangs heavy with dust and oil, a constant gritty fog that settles into hair, into hems, into lungs. Machines clatter and groan like great iron beasts, their rhythms relentless and indifferent. Every clank, every snap of a belt is a reminder that this place was built for production, not for people. Children moved through that landscape the way birds slip through a forest of branches, small, quick, and forever at risk of being unseen. Their faces were often smudged with soot, their fingers stained and nicked from 100 small hazards. Shafts of light through the high windows picked out tiny hands, threaded between gears. The quick, careful reach of someone who has learned to make themselves small in a dangerous world. There was no safety net watching over them, no inspectors to measure the air, no protective gear, no organization like the modern OSHA to slow a machine or pull a child back from harm. And yet the law of the land had begun to stir. In 1833, the Factory Act put down a single, sharp rule. Children under 9 were barred from factory labor. It was a stark sentence in the ledger of change, a recognition, finally, that the very youngest should not be set to such toil. That decree cut only a small slice from the vast canvas of industry. It did not make the mills gentle, nor did it sweep away every perilous habit. But it did set a legal boundary around childhood that had not existed before, a modest protection in a place otherwise indifferent to youth. Walk past the rows of looms and presses, and you can imagine the rhythm of that time. The steady hum of spindle and wheel, whispered orders and the occasional shouted command, the weary hush that fell when someone faltered. The mills were crowded with bodies and with the invisible weight of obligation. Parents pressed to bring home wages, children taught to be industrious before they were allowed to be children. That mixture of necessity and danger made dreadful an everyday word rather than an overstatement. Listen closely, and you hear the small orchestra of hardship. Tiny boots scuffing on plank floors, the soft tired breathing of those who had been standing since dawn, the faint clink of metal, and the dull thump of tired shoulders. Under all of it is a thin, fierce hope that the sacrifice would shelter someone at home, that the day's earnings might mean bread or coal. The Factory Act of 1833 sounds in that soundscape like a small, determined bell, an official note of change amid the larger, harsher chorus of the industrial age. It did not erase the noise or the dust, but it marked a turning point, the first legal step toward recognizing childhood's fragility against the grinding machinery of work. This was the world Victorian children had to work in, noisy, hazardous, often unforgiving, shaped by no modern safety system, and only beginning to accept that the youngest deserved a different fate. They were children so small, an adult could wrap both hands around their shoulders, 5 to 9 years old, and yet they worked in places most grown people avoided. When they came out of the chimneys, they looked as if night itself had crawled all over them, soot-streaked from hairline to heel, each pore and eyelash caked black. The residue clung in the hollows of their faces, in the folds of their clothes, to the tiny knuckles made thin and hard by labor. Their breath tasted of smoke. Every cough brought up a dark, powdery rasp that seemed to settle back into the cracks of their skin. Their bodies were a map of that work. Elbows and knees were raw and split. Thin arms and legs bore narrow streaks of dried blood where skin had been scraped against brick and rough flues. Cuts crusted with grime, and when they moved, the wounds reddened as if the day's work were always still being done. There was no soft bathing, no gentle salve, only a basin of salt water, and whoever happened to be standing by. The brine was ladled over blackened faces and limbs. The salt stung in open sores, drawing tears that mixed with the soot on their cheeks. A coarse cloth was rubbed until the worst of the dirt washed away. And beneath the grime were the small, tired bodies everyone could not help but notice. No time was wasted on comfort. Once rinsed and shoved upright, they were sent back into another narrow shaft, into the dark throat of a different house. They climbed, crawled, and squeezed as if born to the stone, returning again and again, with soot pressed into their skin like a second coat of clothing. Their wounds waited to be washed with the same briny water. Then they were sent up to begin the cycle once more. The routine left little room for anything but endurance, and the sight of those tiny blackened figures, soot in their hair, salt on their cheeks, hands that had learned to hold on to the flue, remained with anyone who saw them, a stark, unforgettable picture of childhood shaped by soot and sorrow. Children in factories labored in dangerous conditions for 14 to 18 hours a day, a grind that left little room for childhood. Occupational death was not uncommon. Their small size made them ideal for crawling into the tight spaces in, around, or under machines, sometimes even while the machines were still running, because stopping them would hinder production. In the roar of gears and the smell of oil, tiny hands risked being crushed for the sake of keeping a mill moving. When they were not inside mills, or when they had nowhere left to go, these children moved through the city like ghosts that no one quite noticed, small lean figures slipping in and out of alleys and side streets beneath the flicker of gaslight. They clustered in doorways and huddled against wet brick, boots worn to the soles. Many were orphans, their parents taken by disease or accident, left without a roof or a name. But orphanhood was only part of the picture. A large number came from homes where neglect was common, where alcohol dulled a parent's care until it vanished, and where abuse, physical or emotional, made cruelty seem ordinary. Faced with the choice between a house that harmed them and the uncertain freedom of the street, some children chose the street. That choice was never romantic. It was survival. The streets offered a hard, cold independence. No steady bed, no reliable meal, but also an end to nightly beatings behind closed doors. On wet nights, they huddled under shop awnings, trading scraps of food and gossip, and slept in small groups for warmth. By day, they became part of the city's living texture, a tangle of small bodies darting through crowds, learning to read faces and judge moods, bargaining and begging with a skill age had not yet dulled. The dangers they faced were immediate and terrible. Left unprotected, many were preyed upon by those who sought to profit from their vulnerability. Prostitution drew in some, a grim path pointed out by predators promising money, shelter, or simply escape from something worse. Others turned to thieving, not because they were born to crime, but because theft became a daily means of feeding themselves and staying warm. Pickpocketing, pilfering from market stalls, or borrowing items that never made it back became familiar habits, small transgressions that could save a life one day and doom it the next. Yet the same streets also held pathways to work that, while still harsh, offered steadier wages and a sliver more dignity. Many sold newspapers, matches, fruit, or flowers, calling out in the mornings and carrying heavy baskets through the crowds. Some shined boots or ran errands for shopkeepers, doing public jobs that fit into the crowded rhythm of urban marketplaces. These tasks demanded fearlessness, quick hands, and endless patience, qualities learned in a single hazardous season on the streets and honed by necessity. This was a childhood lived in public, exposed, dangerous, and inventive. It was marked by hunger and hardship, by the constant threat of exploitation, and by small, stubborn acts of resilience. A patched coat fastened with hope, a saved coin tucked away, whispered rules passed down by older kids. Each child navigated choices forced upon them by poverty and neglect, trying to make a life from the meager possibilities offered by a city that often looked the other way. Thankfully, a philanthropy movement, driven by exceptional people like Dr. Barnardo, turned its attention to the plight of children living in dire circumstances, the children of the slums. Barnardo and others put real effort into providing housing, food, and education to the poorest young people. The hope was simple and urgent: to bring them into society as valuable members, to give them a chance at a life, to steer them away from crime and bitter prospects, and toward something like hope and possibility. The page that holds this story is plain and unadorned, but it contains a small, defiant anchor, published by Paxton Price on Deck 11, 2012. Those 7 words sit like a name carved into a windowsill, like a date stamped on the margin of an old photograph, quick and plain, but heavy with implication. They tell us that someone, a person with a name that feels both like a signature and a possibility, chose that day to push thought into the world. December light is a particular kind of light. Low and cool, a soft wash over streets and rooms already tucking themselves in for winter. In 2012, that light fell on a world vibrating with modular screens and restless conversation. The American election had closed its chapter a month before. People were making holiday lists and scanning the horizon for what would come next. Social networks were humming. Ways that words traveled were changing. And that little line, published by Paxton Price on Deck 11 to Side 12, belongs to the moment when publication could be both intimate and public, a private declaration lodged in the steady machinery of the Internet and print alike. Read slowly, the line becomes a small story of its own. It names an authorial voice, places that voice on the calendar, and offers a trace for anyone who follows. Paxton Price becomes a point on a map of ideas, anchored to a winter day, a date that helps a reader orient. When this was made public, what the world felt like, what technologies and temperaments shaped how it might be received. In that economy, the little printed sentence acts as a hinge, swinging the private toward the public and formalizing an intention. Here, on this day, this was offered to the world. There's a quiet courage in a publication date. It is the first step that cannot be walked back, however small the audience. Timestamps turn ephemeral thought into something that can be cited, debated, remembered. They let future readers trace a lineage of ideas to see how a sentence or argument sits in the flow of years. December 11th, 2012 becomes both an ordinary calendar mark and a singular tether to the act of making something public. At the same time, the line invites speculation without forcing it. It asks you to imagine the rehearsed sentences, the erasures, the late decisions, and the small satisfactions that led to the push of a publish button. Then it leaves the specifics unspelled, respectful of both mystery and fact. The modest printed phrase does its work quietly, offering possibility rather than explanation, a thin, bright thread between the mind that made the thing and the people who will read it. Every reader brings a different memory to that hinge, their own December light, their own sense of 2012, their own experience of finding a line of attribution at the top or bottom of a page. Some will glance and move on, others will pause, feeling in the softest way that they are touching someone else's moment in time. That simple line becomes a connective tissue across whatever distance the world permits. So the sentence performs its small ceremony. It tells us who claimed the work and when, and in doing so, it places the text within the lived year of 2012. That precise human detail turns an anonymous sheet into a document with provenance, a whisper that says, "This was made, this was shared, and the moment is recorded."